Mediumistic art is this very weird category. It's not really an art movement. It's more of like a genre of self-taught artists or so-called outsider artists. I think my connection to mediumistic art and my fascination with artists like Madge Gill or Hilma af Klint, of course, who's become very in vogue in recent years. That was mostly because these were artists who were working from some kind of inner experience that was outside of the historical conversation or the critical conversation about art. And I think most of modern art, if you go to art school and you get indoctrinated into those institutions, the way you're taught to think about modern art is that it's this conversation with a history that has been selected for you already, which is like modern art history, and it's, you have to have a conversation with post-minimalism, or you have to have a conversation with Dada or something like that, and, reference that in your work and have this self-referentiality. And rarely is there room allowed for the artist who just has this intense experience in life and has to find an outlet for it. That is usually relegated to the realm of the so-called outsider.
Welcome to the Casual Temple. This week, we're so very excited to chat with Alessandro Keegan, who is a visual artist, writer, an art history professor with an MFA from the School of Art of the Art Institute of Chicago and an MA from the Brooklyn College. Trained as a gemologist, he worked at the Gemological Institute of America until 2012. Now based in Walden, New York, Keegan's art explores psychological realms through abstract geometric and organic imagery, inspired by his visionary experiences and personal cosmology, mystical science. Alessandro, I'm so happy to welcome you here to the Casual Temple.
Hello, Marilee. Hi, how's it going?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk about my work. And
Yes, I messaged you and I let you know that I heard you a long time ago on this podcast that I've listened to since 2005 called Ghostly Talk. And they had invited you on, and I was like, wow, what? And I took a look at your work and I was like, yes, this is amazing.
Oh, that was a while ago,
Yeah,
actually.
it was
That was
a
like
while
during COVID, I think.
Yeah.
That was 2020, maybe,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think they invited me on the podcast because I had just given a talk on YouTube that was like a live talk as part of the Brooklyn Book Fair on mediumistic art.
Right.
Topic of mediumistic art. So we might talk about mediumistic art, which is a relevant topic.
I agree. Yes,
Yeah.
I heard that talk. It was really very informative. I loved it.
Good.
Well, we just kind of start at whatever you consider the beginning of your path to creating your art and your writing and becoming a art history teacher.
Yeah. Well, so I think the thing that I like to start off saying sometimes when people ask me, like, where does your work come from? Where does the imagery come from? When did you first decide to be an artist? And that kind of question is that, I didn't always want to be an artist. I'm still not sure if I want to be an artist, actually. I'm just an artist. I'm stuck here now. But, if you asked me when I was a small child, like 10, 11 years old or something like that, what I really saw myself doing later in life, I would say I was interested in science. I wanted to be, in sciences. I loved, biology and geology. And of course, I had a paleontology phase where I loved dinosaurs, as every kid does. Astronomy, all of these topics were very interesting to me. And that interest in that never really left me. I think it was just that as I grew older, later in my life, for my own psychological well-being, I had some, pretty rocky ups and downs throughout my later childhood and adolescence and so forth, and even later into an adulthood, to be totally honest. And, I think art played a larger and larger role in keeping my sanity and saving my life during those times. And I don't want to reduce it to therapy, to personal
Mm.
therapy, but it just became a more central way of me staying centered in my life and keeping my life together. And, by the time I was in college, I was like, well, I'm going to just, pursue this as a career, as absurd as that might be. And I had also been getting, already in my early 20s, I had been getting a lot of positive feedback about my artwork and so forth. So it seemed like it might be something that I could do. But art was, something that I just did. I didn't necessarily see that as my future necessarily. Um, and part of it was, we were talking about visionary experiences right before, we started talking. And part of it was these um, very profound visionary experiences that I had throughout my childhood and adolescence. Some of them still continue to this day, but not with the intensity or the frequency as when I was younger for some reason. I
Hmm.
don't know whether that's like my brain is calcifying as I grow older or what that is. But I think that some of it was that I needed some place to put those experiences. And there was really no, art seemed like the place where the weirdos would go. That seemed
Yep.
like where, if you have things to say or some kind of experience that, will be unacceptable in almost any other avenue of life, you could possibly be an artist. And
Right.
so I think that's what also was something that helped me gravitate towards that as a career.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so and then art history, later, much later in life, I got my master's in art history at Brooklyn College, and um very fortunate to get teaching positions very quickly. And today, in addition to being a painter, I also am an art history teacher, which I've been doing for almost 10 years now, so a long
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for walking us down this path of your both careers, two
Yeah.
careers. Um, I know if you I know there was like this experience that you had that I told you before we started. I listened to like pretty much every interview with you. Um, that you had seen something in the forest. I don't know if you wanted to share that at all because that was like
Yeah,
kind of opened up.
I should, it gets harder and harder every time I retell this
Oh,
because it's like something that happened to me when I was like 16 years old or
right.
so. I don't exactly remember how old I was. It was like a very long time ago,
Yeah.
but I had frequently had these like strange compulsions that seem to come from outside of myself
Mm,
to go into meditation or to start writing things or start drawing things. And in this particular case, I had this compulsion to go into this wooded area in my hometown of Nyack, where I grew up, that was right behind where the Nyack Elementary School was. I don't even know if it's forest back there anymore, if I went back there. But at the time, it was actually quite a dense forest. And I went up this hill and I went past where the school was into the woods and just went deeper and deeper in there. And there are these thorn bushes. And this was at night. And I also,
mm,
like, all throughout my childhood, I would go out for long walks at night. I kind of always wanted to be out of the house. So I was like going for long walks and I would just walk late into the night sometimes.
mhm,
Which, I don't know, maybe that's safe. I don't know. But then I was like going into this dark forest and there are these thorn bushes in kind of a clearing. And like I was just compelled to be like, that's the place I need to be, is where
mhm,
these thorn bushes are. And I just kind of laid down on them like they were a bed and began to gaze at the stars above me. And that's when I got this very clear, almost a diagrammatic image. It was both in my mind and in front of me at the same time. Um, One of those things that's very impossible to describe when you have these sorts of experiences.
mhm,
And the, you know, it's going to be impossible to describe it visually, but I would say
Right.
the impression that I received was that I was seeing the entirety of the universe and its mechanisms, like how it was functioning,
Yeah.
and its primary uh, creation was being formed by two spheres on either end that were entities or intelligences or other worlds somehow. And one was kind of feeding information to the other, almost as if they were having, like these spheres were having a conversation. And it was coming through like these kind of rays of data, and the reality that we were seeing, like all matter, the vines around me, the sky above me, the earth, the soil, everything. This was a kind of physical manifestation
Hmm.
of the information language that was being transmitted from this one sphere to the other. Um, I should say also, I started taking psychedelic drugs at a very young age. So, it'd be very easy for someone to, dismiss all of my things and be like, well, you also, you were stoned all the time when
Right.
you were a kid, and fair enough. My mind was probably very fragile, but you could also say that it made me perhaps more of a receptacle for these impressions. But anyway, so the what I came away from this is that it seemed like everything in the universe was not created intentionally, but was almost
Mm.
part of a message. And the actual message we could not comprehend, or we have no way of knowing that, because it was going to this other end, this other entity, this other sphere.
Mm.
And we were just kind of like the residue of that. Um, I
Yeah.
mean, this is again one of these things that's, you could take this apart, dissect it, and do an
Totally.
analysis of it. But what I would say is the reason I mentioned that experience a lot, there were other very intense experiences that I had throughout my life, but the reason I mentioned that one a lot is because when I was like 16 or 17, I don't exactly remember the age I was at it when this happened, but it created a baseline for me to understand a lot of other things in the universe
Mm.
and
Hmm.
other mystical traditions. And it also gave me an actual experience that was real to me, that
Yeah.
I could draw upon when judging the world around me, or when I would be reading things like, we were talking about Kabbalah and, all these other different mystical traditions or religious traditions. When I would be reading about these subjects, they had this resonance for me, because I was like, "Ah, yes, that's like that experience that I had,
Hmm.
um, and it does inform my art as well. It's one of the kind of founding experiences that I think about a lot when I'm trying to understand what I'm painting.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
so amazing. Yeah, definitely when I heard you explaining that, and then we talked, how I studied the Kabbalah, and I'm like, yep, sounds like the two pillars on either side, and they're kind of balancing the energy. Yeah, I was like, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. And we
Um,
were talking about this, and I was saying, like, it's a coincidence if any of my
yes,
ideas sound like these other traditions.
totally.
So it's just fascinating to me, actually.
Oh gosh. And the other thing it was reminding me of, because my husband, Jason, he had this experience where I think he was taking a nap. I always get it wrong. And he's like, you told it wrong. But I'll get the highlights here. But I think he was taking a nap, and then he got the sense that he was pulled out of his body. And then he was like taking a like 30,000 foot view of the universe. And he said it looked like a machine, and it was a beautiful machine, and it had like these bubbles coming in and out of it, like it was making, and the bubbles were popping and moving and stuff. And there was a voice that asked him this, which is funny because I always think, oh, it's kind of a leading question. But the voice asked him, isn't it beautiful, isn't this beautiful? And then he was
Mm.
like, like, this is really beautiful. And then he had told me about that. And then I was like, oh, that sounds like, because I'm studying the Kabbalah. There's actually each Sephira, there's a visionary experience you have that's associated with it. And one of them is the machinery of the universe. Is you see the vision and the machinery of the universe. I was like, that sounds like the machinery of the universe. And he's not studying the Kabbalah, right? But I just think it's so amazing. Like sometimes these things kind of, yeah, they kind of go together. You have no idea about it. So it's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
no, that's machinery of the universe. I love that description.
Yeah.
And for me, when I was late in my teens, I picked up Plato's Republic, and
Mm.
there's a book in there. There's a passage in there that's called the story of And, if I'm remembering it correctly off the top of my head, it's like this warrior who dies and he has a near-death experience, and then he comes
Right.
back from the near-death experience and he describes the mechanisms of the universe that he sees during this out-of-body experience. And
Mm-hmm.
there's like a spindle at the center, and the souls revolve around this spindle, and there's emanations coming out of this spindle. And Plato gives a very, intense description. And, most people see this as allegory, of
Right.
course. But when I was reading this, I was like, that sounds very, resonant with what I had experienced when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I do see the world, whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know, but I do see the metaphysical, invisible forces of the world functioning a bit like a machine, or
Mm-hmm.
having a kind of clockwork like efficiency to them. And that doesn't, discount spirit or God or any of these other religious ideas.
Right.
It's just that seems to make sense to me. And that might also be because I have this, scientific brain that's like it's you have to make it make sense in a
Yes.
mechanical way.
Right. Yes. I very much align with that sort of
Yeah.
thinking. Like it has to make sense. I have to understand it. So yeah, I get it. It might be through machines. Um, but did you have, so as you know, you had this experience, you're becoming an artist. Did you have any support or guidance along the way? Any mentors or people that kind of helped you along?
I really, I had definitely people who helped me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, certainly I would not be able to be a professional artist and be making a living if people didn't, put my work in a show, or, curate me into a group show, and then, my work was seen and so forth. Like I would probably be some, hermit just making paintings in their garage or something like that. And I also especially remember like the one person who like really believed in me a lot when I was very young was my high school art teacher, Mrs. Deborah Alter, who I'm still in touch with. And I actually though have to say, like, if I probably didn't have her as someone who saw talent in me somehow,
Yeah.
I probably would not have had a very successful life or anything. I don't know. I probably would have continued down a very self-destructive path,
Oh,
actually.
wow.
Because honestly, like I was kind of a misfit a little bit when I was a young kid. I had a small group of friends. I had a very misanthropic outlook, a very cynical outlook. I still have that a little bit today, but
Yeah.
I take it in stride. I'm a dad now. I'd like to have some hope about the future and humanity and so forth. So, but it was I don't, obviously there's people who always help you along the way, but I
Yeah.
don't think I ever had like a spiritual teacher or
Mm.
someone who would guide me or initiate me in any way. I think I really had to do a lot of things on my own, figure out things through trial and error, which
Yeah.
is pretty rough. Yeah, it's not
Yep.
the best way to do it, you know. But yeah, no, and also, and this goes towards like my attitude. We were talking before the show, and like you were saying, like I feel like I'm a heretic, like I'm kind of outside the mainstream or the schools of religious or mystical thought.
Yeah.
And, I'm fine if people think that I say things that are heretical or unorthodox in some ways, because I never really felt comfortable with any kind of institution or any sort of organized system of initiation or anything. That's just me. And I just, and so that's obviously also made it a little difficult for me to have any guidance, from other people
Right.
or take guidance from other people,
Yeah.
that kind of anti-authoritarian streak that I have.
Yeah. Uh
But
yeah, Jason and I were just talking yesterday. Actually, he was mentioning it because I'm pretty sure you and I are close in age. I'm kind of the younger end of Gen X or whatever. And Jason's like right in the middle of Gen X. So anyway, he was like, yeah, basically Gen X is like anti-authoritarian, not like we want to do it ourselves. Da, 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 da. Um, but I think that that particular thing is a segment of Gen X because, as you know, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are that when you grew up that were very happy to be in the mainstream or whatever. Um,
yeah, I
but
definitely think it might be something of our generation.
yeah,
That I'm fine with that accusation that I'm
right,
that
exactly.
I'm
That's
like
cool.
typical anti-authoritarian Gen Xer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So that makes sense. Yeah. Again, I'm like resonating with what you're saying because like I don't think I had necessarily guidance. I had a little bit of guidance and people that I like their writing and stuff like that. Um,
Yeah, and also though I can't stress enough how
yeah.
important my high school art teacher was.
Oh, for
I know it
real.
seems like it's so long ago, but
Yeah.
like like I think most adults or older people, when I was growing up, like were like, well, something's wrong with this kid. They were like, he,
Yeah.
he needs to be, put away or something like that. Like, I don't think a lot of people were very open-minded. And, sorry to get off on this rant here, but this is something that I've been thinking about, because a lot of times, I hear art students or even older artists as well who feel alienation
Yeah.
from their families because they're making art or they found a career in arts, or they feel alienation from a community of some sort. And it's unfortunate because we supposedly value art and what the cultural contribution of
Right.
artists in our society, but part of the reality of being an artist is that you immediately position yourself outside of society in some way.
Hmm.
Obviously there's artisans and craftspeople who have social, societal roles that are very clearly defined. But the kind of modern conception of an artist is, not very compatible with, functioning, society in a lot of ways. And
Yes.
it's a hard thing to swallow, but like it's hard to justify the existence of art, in some
Mm.
cases. And that's just kind of a reality of it. And so, I think it's a rare person like my high school art teacher who
Yeah.
sees that kind of in like that kind of anti-authoritarian, not gnostic rebellious spark within the artist, and is like, it's like, actually that's exactly what someone should do, or
Right.
that's actually fine behavior in a certain person,
Uh,
but
yeah.
you know
What a wonderful way to like thank your art teacher. Yeah, I was thinking back to basically my favorite teachers in school were all my art teachers because they're always the weird teacher. And they would always talk
Good.
about like, either energy or they would talk about like your feelings. Just was like not what the other teachers would talk about necessarily.
Good. I'm glad being an art teacher is available as a
Yes.
life option
Right.
for those who
Exactly.
cannot conform to society.
Yes. That's amazing. Um, and so I know that you do have some favorite artists. Like I mentioned, I listened to your Mediumistic talk, which is amazing. Everybody should listen to it because it was very informative. Um, but do you have some favorite artists that I hate saying inspired because some people get a little like, weird about that, but like some that you look at and you're like, wow, that's impressive and I appreciate that.
I mean, I'm an art history teacher, so history is like filled with art that I have an admiration for or that resonates with me.
Mhm.
It's really, that is a difficult thing. I don't think I ever looked to an artist for direct inspiration, though at various times I'll be working on something and I'll step back from it and an artist from history will come to mind,
Mm. Hmm.
and I will see something of them in what I'm doing. But I think if I had to, mediumistic art is this very weird category. It's not really an art movement. It's more of like a genre of self-taught artists or so-called outsider artists.
Right.
And I think my connection to mediumistic art and my fascination with artists like Madge Gill or Hilma Afklimt, of course, who's become very in vogue in recent years.
Hmm.
That was mostly because these were artists who were working from some kind of inner experience that was outside of the historical conversation or the critical conversation about art. And I think most of modern art is, or, if you go to art school and you get indoctrinated into those institutions, the way you're taught to think about modern art is
Mm.
that it's this conversation with a history that has been selected for you already, which is like modern art history, and it's, you have to have a conversation with post minimalism, or you have to have a conversation with Dada or something like that, and reference that in your work and have this self-referentiality. And rarely is there room allowed for the artist who just has this intense experience in life and has to find an outlet for it. That is usually relegated to the realm of the so-called outsider, the artist from the Prinzhorn collection, which is a German collection from the early 20th century of artists who were mentally, people who were mentally ill and they were in an institution. And this one doctor collected the art that they were making. And they're fantastic, beautiful works of art. And that's kind of where this, um, you know, inexplicable passion to create something in the world has been relegated.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
I just, as when I was an art student, I identified more with the motives of outsider artists, or I identified more with specifically those that were mediumistic or claiming mediumship as a source of inspiration. I would also include William Blake in that category, even though
Right.
he's this major canonical artist from history. But, he talks about visionary experiences. He worked in seances and made drawings during seances and stuff. Shockingly, the author Victor Hugo also made drawings during a seance, so in an automatic way. So when I think about artists who I am in conversation with, it's those artists, not so
Right.
much, Frank Stella, or, RIP Frank Stella. Frank Stella's, great work, just passed recently, but like the modern canonical artists of history, those works are fascinating to me. But I also feel like there's another alternative tradition that I resonate with.
Mm.
Um, and I would also say, like, art historically, I also feel a very strong connection to the movement of Romanticism from from the late 18th century into the 19th century,
Yeah.
that William Blake was a part of, Goya, Fuseli, and so on and so forth. Even though my work might not necessarily look like romantic painting from the 18th century,
Right.
but that spirit of, kind of breaking with enlightenment, rationality, and going into these places that were visionary or emotional or something like that, that to me is also a kind of an alternative history of art that I resonate with.
Yeah.
So
Ooh, yeah. So I appreciate, and I think you definitely go into how like the mediumistic art and how they were receiving these messages. And when I was listening to your lecture about that, I was thinking about my sister and I went to a retreat recently to learn about it was full of like Filipino Americans because our mother is Filipino. And it was like finding your like indigenous roots, right? And so I was like, what is it actually, and the term indigenous was like kind of put out there, and I was like, what is it actually, what is indigenous roots, what is being indigenous, what is the indigenous mindset? And then when you were when I was listening to your, I was like, oh, there's something about mediumistic art receiving, and the indigenous mind is also a receiving. And that's what, like, the indigenous person is considered more balanced, right? Because you're a receiver, but you actually put into the world. So it's just like more of a conversation. Whereas like the Western mind is like, I just put into the world, right? I don't receive because that's my ego doesn't want to receive, but I put into the world. So when I was like, oh, I think it's like mediumistic art or medium, being a medium is literally listening and receiving, and being indigenous is receiving. So I was like, oh, okay. So it actually, like, listening to your talk about it kind of like clicked to those two things for me.
Man, that's a great point. That's like, I really like that way of thinking about it. I
Mhm.
actually hadn't thought about it explicitly in that way, but when you say it, that, the Western mindset of creating art is production. It's
Yeah.
like this industrial, post-industrial idea of just like making it, putting it out, Andy Warhol,
Right.
mass producing prints and stuff.
Yeah.
And the mediumistic art taps into a different tradition related to indigenous cultures or more ancient or more traditional cultures where the artist isn't just this maker of stuff, but
Right.
is also a receiver of things. Like they have to be open to messages or ideas, that I
Mhm.
really like that way of thinking about it. Actually, I wasn't thinking about it that way, but now that you say it, I'm going to see it that way. Actually, that's very interesting.
Oh, well, glad to glad to
Yeah.
put that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was like a back and forth thing conversation.
Mhm.
Um, thank you for that. Oh, and then so I think you also mentioned the artist Paulina Peavey,
Oh,
who when you talked about her,
Paulina
I was
Peavey.
like,
Yeah.
whoa, very interesting stuff that was going on.
Yeah. She has just started to, I think, get some attention.
Hmm.
Andrew Edling Gallery in New York did a large retrospective of her work. And there's a catalog that came out. I'm actually blanking on the author of the catalog. I have it like right over on a shelf over here, but I'm blanking on the author, but it's, the first really in-depth, it just came out last year. And it's the first really in-depth writing about Paulina Peavey's work.
Wow.
Back when I did that lecture, I was just pulling on whatever I could find online. There were YouTube videos of her appearing on like talk shows as a novelty act from that I found on YouTube. And and she is so fascinating. There's so many levels to her work, but she's actually a trained artist. Like she went to art school,
Hey.
and you can see that facility, that ability, with creating these translucent, luminescent forms in her work. But then she went to a seance and she started receiving messages from a being that she called Lakamo. But she said this being was a UFO. So it appeared as like I mean, I guess like a flying saucer to her, but it was a spirit at the same time. And she would make these masks, these ornate, decorative, jeweled masks. She would put them on. And by putting them on, she would transform her mindset and she would go into this trance state, which, is very shamanistic,
Yeah.
of wearing the costume to go into a different, to allow a spirit to enter into you and so forth. And Lacamo would write or paint or whatever. She would apparently wear the mask while making her paintings, and it's really a fascinating ritualistic idea. I also, from the perspective of like, the UFO phenomenon, which
Hmm.
has been in the news lately over the last few years with whatever the tic tac flying,
Right.
in
Yeah.
military videos and stuff. It's an interesting perspective that she applies to the UFO phenomenon
Yeah.
because she's viewing them as life forms, not as technological devices, but as these kind of spirits manifesting as a technological device, which resonates, I think, more with my perspective
Yep.
on UFOs as well, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of what mine is too, especially again going back to sort of your artwork, like the geometric stuff. It's you wouldn't think that some of those things would look like that or whatever, right? Because you think of spirit being like a flowy blob, right?
Mhm.
not like a sphere or a diamond. You don't think that, or a saucer. Yeah. But it's like, nope, sometimes they come through like that.
That's interesting
Yeah.
that you say that actually, because
Mhm.
right now I'm in the process of writing. This is kind of like a preview of something that I'm
Ooh.
doing in the works. I'm in the process of writing a catalog essay for the artist Francis Smokowski,
Mhm.
who's a mediumistic artist and a mystical artist who shows at Kevin Morris Gallery in New York. And part of what my thesis is in this essay that I've been writing, her works are very biomorphic and solid, and they have this kind of biological mass to them. My own work also has sometimes this kind of geometry mixed with something
Right.
biological or crystalline. Sometimes it seems hard and solid and heavy and weighted. Sometimes it seems ethereal. And I find it interesting that there is this assumption that the spirit or the metaphysical is going to be like auras of light, and like
Right.
clouds, like a kind of misty vapor, like a ghost or something.
Yeah.
Um, when, there's really like nothing to dictate what the forms of the invisible should look like. They can
Right.
really take on any form, and also, and I'm also very skeptical that there even is such a clear separation between matter and spirit either. I mean,
Yeah.
there's long traditions of the body being a source of mystical experience through meditation and tantra and things like that.
Hmm.
And I also am not completely, yeah. And then, and also like even you think of indigenous traditions that, are animistic
Right.
and hold that there is a invisible nature to trees or water or stones, sacred stones and so forth. I'm just not I'm personally not certain that there is this spirit realm that's in this ethereal place that's totally separate from the world.
Right.
And then we're just in the coarse matter, material, weighty, heavy world, and that these two are not interlinked or intertwined in some way,
Hmm.
So yeah, so yeah, could the spirit take on the form of a technological device? Absolutely.
I mean, I would say, like, in that vein, I know this is my goofy example, but I listen to a lot of music and I would swear, like, my device, whether it's my car stereo or whatever, is like picking the songs I would have picked next, or it picks like the perfect song, right? Of whatever's going on in my life or whatever. Like, it's like kind of having a conversation with me of like through music and everything. So I don't know.
Oh man. I mean,
Yeah.
technology is getting so strange. I mean,
Yes.
I've
Yeah.
been thinking about how technology is affecting us as
Hmm.
metaphysical beings,
Yeah.
and by the way, I talk a lot of stuff. This isn't all necessarily related to my art necessarily, but
Right. Yeah.
coming from the perspective I do, uh, you know, all of this kind of issue, concerns me, especially like someone who's an art historian and is looking at the way technology has changed society and culture and so forth.
Hmm.
And, I mean, obviously, we are taking a shift towards a more technological society, a more material based society that's been happening for the last 200 years at least.
Right.
But I find it interesting, and I don't know, what to make of this quite,
Yeah.
but I can speculate. I find it interesting that the more our technology evolves, the more it moves towards the things that are intangible or of the spirit,
Yes.
artificial intelligence that's trying to emulate the thought processes of the mind,
Hmm.
or and so on and so, or the internet that we're talking over. We
Yeah.
are on opposite sides of the country right now, but our disembodied images and voices are being transmitted across time and space. All of that 200 years ago would sound very fantastic and metaphysical,
Yeah.
or like something, a kind of industrial machinery mechanisms, and moved more towards what I would say is a kind of ethereal, um, information based, thought based, mind based. It's disembodying us more as
Yes.
technology progresses. And I don't know what that is going to signal, in the future. I
Right.
can guess, but I think that's an interesting thing. And so maybe your car radio, maybe the iPod, it's not iPods anymore, your
Yeah.
iPhone shuffle or whatever,
Yeah.
Gen Xer again,
Right. Yeah.
I'm saying iPods here, but like your iPhone, shuffle, maybe that is now connecting with your mind in some way, or maybe you are
Mm-hmm.
connecting with it metaphysically on another level that you're not aware of.
Yeah.
You don't know how your subconscious or your oversoul or
Right.
your
Yeah.
daimon, or whatever is interacting with the technology around you. It could very well.
Yeah. Um, it's fascinating. Yeah, I do think that that's where a lot of our technological advances are trying to emulate, like you said, you're saying very well, like it's trying to emulate spirit or like stuff that people have been experiencing on a metaphysical level. So that's really fascinating. And even I think you had mentioned sort of like how we even talk about things from the spirit, like getting downloads is hilarious because we're using like technological language. But I think because, well, I was like, yeah, I think because that's the language that is perforated and that people can reach for, like, yeah, a download, that's what it means.
That's totally like a product of our time.
Yeah,
We would say, if Joan of Arc was alive today, she would say, I
right,
got a download,
right, exactly.
from the angels,
Yeah, like,
you
oh,
know.
okay. Or even sort of I tend to see like I have I think it's hypnopompic. When I wake in the morning, I tend to have like these visions of the code. Like I call it the code.
Like the hypnagogic state of like between waking and sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's the hypnopompic. So it's when I'm waking up
Oh,
instead of falling asleep. I know there's like the two terms. I always confuse them.
okay.
So hypnopompic, I think, is when you wake up, and that's usually what happens. But I always like, I'll kind of like be half awake and see like the code of like the door in my bedroom. Like it looks like code, but it's like different symbols. And the symbols keep changing, actually. They keep changing what they look like, but they operate in a very similar I call it the matrix code. It looks like that, but it's per object in it. It's very weird.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical of the rationale behind the we live in a simulation
Oh, right.
hypothesis.
Yes.
But I think though, like the we live in the matrix, the simulation thing,
Yeah.
this is again a attempt to put into the most contemporary language something that is a long held traditional perspective
Right.
about the immateriality of the world or the different veils of illusion in the world.
Yeah.
um, I would say, you know, the perspective that I have moved more towards,
Mm-hmm.
as I've been thinking about the nature of reality and where these different visionary experiences come from, is less so the idea that this world is like a kind of illusionary realm of
Right.
matter and that there is a better
Right.
world or a kind of alternate reality, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and we're like sitting with like alternate reality goggles on or
Right.
something and then, seeing this illusion and stuff, but rather that there is actually one solid, consistent reality, but it
Yeah.
just has multiple layers that are
Yes.
there but not perceptible or invisible and so forth. So
Yeah.
not that it's all a simulation,
Right.
but if your hardware, if you're rather no, if your software, if your brain software
Yes.
malfunctions a little bit, you might perceive the other layers of this consistent universe that we're in,
Yeah.
and it might lead you to the conclusion that it's not real or that it's
Right.
a veil or that it's glitching or something like that. Um, but I would err more towards the side of this is the real world,
Mm-hmm.
but there's many different levels, just
Yeah.
and again, we were talking about having our scientific minds. Like you and I both are kind of like err towards like being rationalist, scientific, even when we're in the face of undeniable strangeness and
Right.
mysticism. And I tend to, move towards the most objective, empirical interpretation first
Right.
before I speculate on things that are outside of my experience. And it seems like it would be more plausible given the fact that we already know through quantum physics and so forth that there are multiple invisible layers of time and space, in reality and so forth. um so it's really not much of a stretch then to say that we might be seeing like, you know, that isn't multiple dimensions, but it's like one world that has multiple layers to it, like a kind of cake, or
Yeah.
something, and just most of them are invisible.
Yes, you just can't see them. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe you don't want to.
I know it's too much, man. I just
It might be.
give me the
Yeah.
basics. It's too much to
I'm
think about.
probably better off just limiting my perspective.
Yeah. Oh, and as you were talking about the layer, yeah, because one of the experiences in these hypnopompic things, I had the very first time I saw I call it the code, but the first time I
Mm.
saw it, it appeared on a piece of parchment paper, like it was like a scroll in my bed. It was really weird. But
Mm.
then they were like, it was like the code on it and it was switching. And then for whatever reason, I asked, I was like, hey, can you rotate it? Like rotate it. And it rotated and I saw layers. So it was like sheets of parchment, like like it's all turtles down, but it was all parchments down and it all had different code at what I could see on the different layers of parchment. And I was like, what is this?
See, that's so interesting because it's
Yeah.
responding to
Yes.
your thought, to your prompt,
Yeah.
nonverbal prompt.
Yeah.
So to me, obviously, like I've had strange experiences. I don't know exactly what you're experiencing, but
Yeah.
just as an outsider hearing this,
Mm-hmm.
it suggests to me that there is some connection between your inner self and the outer perception that you're having.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and now one person might say, well, this just goes towards this being a psychological phenomenon. You're half dreaming, half awake.
Yeah.
I've had like sleep paralysis where I've seen things or
Right.
perceived entities and so forth. So that would be the more psychological response.
Mm-hmm.
Though I would also say that I think it's very possible that on rare occasions, the universe or the matter of perception that you have gets affected or distorted by what you're emanating, by your own perception, and it
Mm-hmm.
it is real, but it's only happening because your frame of mind or your
Right.
spiritual state that you're in,
Yeah.
we were talking about practicing the lesser banishing before this. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're practicing rituals and so forth, like that may, you know, give some kind of energy, particle,
Yeah.
release that could distort the usual limits that are put on your perception of the world. So, and it could be reacting. And I think about this in regards to, when among other weird things, like I saw a UFO when I was younger, and I
Right.
think about this sighting of the UFO twice, actually, when I was very young. And I think about this sighting and I also think about other people who've shared stories like that with me
Mm-hmm.
that are just so like it's just something that kind of is shouldn't be there and it just enters into the world and then it leaves and it's silent and there's no explanation and you seem to be the only one who's like
Right.
affected by it or
Yeah.
concerned about it. Um, there was this other experience I had when I was very young. I I sort of have just put it into a bin of like weird things I mention every now and then when I want to mention something weird,
Yeah.
because I just don't know what to make of it. But I had been laying down in my room as probably like 8 or 9 years old. I don't know. Been laying down in my bedroom, maybe asleep, maybe I woke up or something. And I got up, and then just like plain as day, there was a large brown owl that was like 4 or 5 feet tall, a giant owl just
Wow.
standing in the room. And then it flew. up a lampshade, and somehow between flying from being this large creature to being up the lampshade, it somehow compressed and then just
Yeah.
like went into the lampshade. And I was just like,
What?
okay,
Yeah.
what do I do with that?
Yeah.
And I just remember, and I think like maybe I mentioned it to my mom and she was like, oh, that's weird. And
Yeah.
fortunately, my mother had, I come from a long line of people seeing weird things. So,
Right.
so fortunately, my mother would just be like, oh, well, when I was your age, I used to see faces looking at me through the window of our second floor bedroom, and so forth. And I was
Mhm.
like, oh, that's interesting, Mom. It's not reassuring, but,
Right,
it'd be
exactly.
like things like that. Or like, apparently my great grandmother saw elves and things like that. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so, I've kind of put that into this category of just like, well, maybe there's some kind of invisible, world that we can perceive sometimes. But I also think that it was very possible that that was a artifact of my own consciousness affecting the world.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe something that I'm putting out. And here's the other thing about mediumistic art and the creation of art actually also is as much as I have opened myself up to channeled writings and drawings that have led to my paintings and so forth, I also think that by making paintings, I've also brought some of those experiences to me, if that makes sense, right? Like,
Yes.
so I think it goes both ways. It's like practicing a ritual. If you have let's say a visionary experience while you're meditating, as I have, like I've seen, like I've been meditating and then like things will get kind of wavy as I'm in this state of calm. And then I start to see these kind of like crystal orbs surrounded by metallic liquid. And then I go and I start to like sketch something and try to figure out what this is that I'm seeing. That's one avenue, that's one route. But I think I've also had the exact opposite, where the things that I perceive when I'm in meditation or when I was younger, when I would take psychedelic drugs and so forth, they look like things out of my paintings. And I'm like, wait, is that the thing that I painted, or did I paint it and now I'm transmitting it into my world or my
Mm-hmm.
perception of the world? And I think it can go both ways. But that also doesn't mean that it's and also here's the other thing. I say also it doesn't mean that it's not real, because it's because I'm actually not concerned with defining reality,
Right.
like to me it's real if it has an impact on your experience, if it affects your life,
Yeah.
if to you that perception was real and you feel changed afterwards,
Yeah.
that's the reality of it. Like there's no other measure for the reality of it, you
Yeah.
know. Obviously, would I like to capture a phantom UFO tulpa thing in a jar and show it to the world? That would probably be something quite interesting for everyone.
Right.
But, also then what would the value of that be either, Anyway,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so the reality, and this is also, when I write about artists who are mediumistic or not, that I never ask myself if they're genuine or not, if they really talk to spirits, or if they
Mm-hmm.
really saw a vision, or I never ask myself that because, well, first of all, I identify with their experiences, so I know that those things can happen.
Right.
But I also don't ask that because the art is real, and the way that the art affects me is all that really matters at the end of the day, or the way, or what
Mm-hmm.
that art puts into the world is all that really matters.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
anyway,
I think that's a great way to explain it because yeah, I think everybody would love, like if you capture Bigfoot, you could show everybody here's Bigfoot. It's never going to happen, just so you know. But, um, it's just the idea of the experience being valid, being, especially if it's life changing, right? And I think any person, you could ask them and they could tell you something, whether it be like mystical or even just like reading a poem and how it changed them. So
yeah.
but I think again, I'm always thinking about the Western world and maybe the indigenous world, but the Western world wants you to have the physical, wants you to have or it's not real, right? And then so I think, especially in the time of moving into sort of the new age of like trying to figure out, we need more of the balance of experiences and your feelings being real and valid. So I think that's
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely connected to that divide between the material and the spiritual that is
mm-hmm.
uniquely Western.
Yeah.
I would also say just like modern in general, because certainly
Yeah.
there was a time in Western civilizations, if we go back to, ancient Greece or
Right.
ancient Anatolia or something where there were different viewpoints held about the spiritual and the matter. But I think that schism, I don't know, is Plato responsible for it? Is Descartes responsible for it? That schism between the physical and the spiritual. And also, I do think that's a very modern perspective of like, you know, it needs to be something that we can do something with, or we have to have
Mm,
some kind of practical application of it.
right.
And I think that this goes towards, what is the point of art? What is the purpose of art? And, you know, art can be whatever it is for anyone. No one has to make art.
Right.
If you make art and you enjoy yourself and you enjoy doing it, that's fine. You also don't have to exhibit art, to be an artist or share art or
Yeah.
anything like that. It serves different purposes in different cultures. Art is sometimes part of everyday life, more so for other cultures than it is for, let's say, New York in 2024, where it's more of like an economic system.
Right.
We see art as more of an object, a commodity object. Or the more prevailing idea is that art is something you buy and then you hang it in your home and it's like a decoration or something like that.
Right.
But I think that art, ideally, if you are going to make art and you are going to put it out into the world, the thing to consider is how that will affect reality, actually, because I
Mm,
think that the creation of art can, in a butterfly effect like fashion, shape reality and shape perception. And I know that sounds like this very idealistic, out there kind of mystical. And I'm not like this kind of, raise your vibrations, mystic kind of person,
right.
really, believe surprisingly. But I just think that's very plain. And it might not necessarily be like one painting that shifts reality, but
Yeah.
if we just look at the way um, certain authors have changed language, like
Right.
Dante changes the Italian language, Shakespeare changes the English language, or we look at the way, one artist might affect films, early cinema in the 20th century, and then how that might affect the way television broadcasting is being made. There is a cascade effect where art will find its way, even if it's really marginal, it will
Mm-hmm.
find its way into the mainstream. And that can shape everything about our perception. I mean, the internet is a great example for this, because it's flooded with images that are perceptually seemingly real but also unreal, and it
Mm,
creates this really just, I'm going to use a silly example. Here I have to use a silly example, but like, you know um I've seen like paintings that look like 19th century paintings circulating on social media, and with the name of an artist, and it'll say like 1898 or something like that.
mm,
And I'll see this painting and I'm like, that, I'm an art history teacher. That's not a painting from the 1890s. It looks like a painting, but
right.
the people don't look correct.
Yeah.
The subject matter doesn't seem correct. And it's an AI generated painting. And, all you have to do is look in the comments underneath and someone will call them out on it right away
Right.
and so forth. But increasingly, the technology is going to flood your perception with things that are very hard to distinguish between artifice and reality. So what's the reality? Is it a painting? Is it an AI? That's just one like silly example of that. And so like, I guess I'm saying like, if you don't think art will transform the way you see reality, it will. It might not be like one of my paintings is going to change you forever, but art as a kind of a medium that people use as a practice in society totally affects the way we perceive the world.
Oh, yeah.
And so like, I think that, I try to exercise some responsibility, and I think, artists have to be a little thoughtful if they're going to play in the game of history and put their work into the world, because there is a cascade effect that does, I feel, transform reality and transform culture, certainly, Um, and that's, I think that's like the purpose of art as a social function.
Yeah.
Obviously there's other ways you can use art, materially for your own personal enjoyment or for your own spiritual practice, or however, but I think that that is how it functions in reality. And getting back to what we were saying about the value of art versus the value of capturing a UFO in a jar or something like that,
Right.
those immaterial experiences we'll probably never be able to solidify them. And if we
Yeah.
do, the most radical shift in in how we
Right.
perceive everything,
Yeah.
our world would definitely be changed forever. But the art that is created by those experiences, whether you believe them or not, they are going to go into the world. They're going to affect other people, especially if they're particularly powerful works of art.
Mm-hmm.
And like I see the, Paulina Peavey you mentioned, who does these paintings from inspired by the UFO spirit and so forth. Like I see so many artists today, especially whose work looks a lot like Paulina Peavey. Now, did they look at her work and derive direct inspiration? Possibly. She's kind of having a moment right now, very possible. Certainly Hilma Afklint she had that big Guggenheim retrospective. She's
Right.
definitely having an impact on art that's being created. How aware are contemporary artists emulating those styles and those ideas and those images of their origins? That Hilma Afklint was an occult practitioner and was very involved in performing seances and so forth. Are they aware of Paulina Peavey's alleged origin of this spirit Lacamo that's talking to her?
Mm.
Maybe they are a little bit on a superficial level, but what those artists created now is going to enter into the mainstream like a kind of a virus, whether the um, whether the artists creating those works understand that or not. Like
Right.
they're injecting their work. They might be coming from a totally like secular art school. Like I thought it looked cool and I just want to, imitate their style and stuff. And now when their work ends up in a major gallery, something from far outside the margins of what was acceptable, you know, 30, 40 years ago has now started to leak into a bigger cultural conversation. I don't know.
Mm.
I'm kind of going on
Yeah.
a rant
No.
there, but that's, so that's why I say like the art that is created is the important thing.
Yeah.
um, Whether Paulina Peavey really speaks to a spirit or not, whether Hilma Afklint speaks to the whatever she called them, like the secret masters or the,
Right.
whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter. We'll never
Yeah.
know. And the only thing that really matters is whether we feel something genuine when we look at those works of art.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. I think that's like I never considered that, but it's wonderfully explained. And it made me think of I saw this clip of David Bowie, and he said I'm going to paraphrase because I have tried to find this freaking clip, and I'm going to still hunt for it, but he was being interviewed and he said something about like, and I think there's many points where David had I don't know, he was just very prescient of what he was seeing. I think this interview was like in the late 90s, but he said something like, well, culture, he's like, I see that culture is going to just regurgitate itself. Keep regurgitating. And so when you were talking about the AI painting that was supposed to be of this artist and it wasn't, clearly, because you could identify why it wasn't, it was like that regurgitation of art. And he was like, so that he was saying something about artists, like it's their responsibility of what you're saying of like creating the new thing, creating, even if it doesn't get recognized until 70 years later or whatever, or doesn't get acknowledged 70 years later or whatever. It's just that it's good to keep that fresh because there's we're in that state right now of regurgitation of art.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like oh, what's his name? Fisher. There's
Mm,
this
mm-hmm,
writer, is it Matthew Fisher, Mark Fisher, who wrote about this in an essay that's very well known. He talks about, like, I'm probably butchering this, but he talks about the 21st century being in a kind of stasis or loop.
mm,
And part of the example that he gives is retro style, retro music, and so forth. And that a lot of, he uses the example of bands that sound like post-punk bands from the
oh,
80s that are indistinguishable from punk bands in the post-punk
yes.
bands in the 80s
Yeah,
existing today, and making music videos that also look like they were from the 80s.
that's right.
You
Yeah.
know, yeah, and I do agree with that to some extent. I don't concern myself too much with the idea of the new.
Mm, mm-hmm.
I think that can kind of be a trap for artists a little bit, to keep
True.
worrying about whether I'm doing something that's never been done before. I would say one thing to keep in mind is that prior to the Renaissance,
Mm,
but I would say even more so, like prior to the 19th century, really, the vast majority of art was about upholding traditions. So
mm,
most of history has been about, generation after generation of artisans. You would have the master artisan, and they would pass on their skill, and the way that the quality of your work would be judged would be how well you rose to the level of the person you apprenticed under, and so forth. So the idea of making newness, or making things new and fresh, um, which, I don't want to question David Bowie, because he's definitely a very trippy artist who I'm sure does have a lot of amazing ideas, but, I think that this idea of newness, or that you're going
mm,
to usher in something that's never been seen before, sometimes I think that's a little bit of a false perception about history. But
yeah.
at the same time, though, I do think that um, there's another level of sort of kind of recycling the material that's already been laid out already in terms of style and music and so forth. And I actually think in the last 10 years, especially, we're seeing almost, it's kind of like a bottleneck of art and culture, where we're seeing almost all times, all styles existing all at once,
Mm,
but nothing that really pushes forward or in a new direction.
right.
Um, and I think, like, I'm not, like, I don't want to act like I'm some great cultural critic who has any unique perspective on this or anything like that. But I do think that is partly the responsibility of artists to imagine something new. But I would also say part of that is the market as well. I
Mm,
think that both consumers of art and music are uncomfortable by things that are genuinely disrupting of the status quo. And so
yes.
when something new appears, it is only going to have a very niche, community that's interested in it. So,
Yeah.
like, it's easy, like, in retrospect, I can think about for an example of, like, a band I like from the past, like Throbbing Gristle or something.
Right.
It's like easy to, like, look back on Throbbing Gristle and be like, oh, they were so radical and ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And it's like, at the time, people just thought they were crazy hippies, you know, or doing some weird art school stuff. And they were probably really dismissed by a lot of punk bands.
Yeah.
And, you know, in retrospect, though, we see that that was a revolution, you know, that happened. And likewise, you know, you're probably not going to recognize what is actually of this moment or fresh or breaking new ground until you have that perspective of 10 or 20 years. Um, you know, and also it's in the, you know, galleries and record labels are not going to help it either, because it's not even just like the mass market, you know, like who's going to buy records or who's going to buy art and stuff. It's also, you know, galleries are uncomfortable showing things that don't have a established market, or they don't
Mm,
see where the established market would be.
right.
They're uncomfortable exhibiting things that seem risky, you know, or you know, the artist hasn't maybe proven themselves quite enough yet. And likewise with, you know, record labels as well. Now there's you know, exceptions to the rule, of course. There's a lot of, you know, people who take risks out there, you know. But you know, for the most part, you know, if there isn't an established market for, you know, something other than, you know, kind of retro electronic music, you're going to just see a lot of retro electronic music. You're not going to see, you know, anything like really breaking the mold.
Mm, hmm.
Um, you know, or if you do, it's going to be on some small tape label or something like that. And, you know, and that's, you know, so I guess what I'm saying is like, partly, you know, that's our fault. You know, if
Yeah.
there's nothing
It's a
new,
good point.
it's kind of the artist's fault, but it's kind of our fault actually, you know, as consumers, and also for those who are, you know, helming, you know, at the helm of in, institutional, you know, avenues for those artists to exhibit their work or sell their work and so forth, you know.
Hmm.
That's my take on that, you know, on that David Bowie take, you know. That's my
Yeah.
response to David Bowie there, you know.
All right. We'll see what if he responds. But
I
no,
await his response,
yes, I
yes.
await his answer.
Yes.
That was really cool. Yeah, I didn't think about that. But as you talk about things, I'm like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense, especially like bands, because I love post-punk music. And I was like so excited in the late tens when there was a lot of bands like doing similar sound, you know.
Oh
Um,
yeah, and I have nothing against like
yeah,
retro sounding bands that
exactly.
are very cool, you know.
Yeah,
But, you know, that if the things that are really weird, some of them become very successful, but, you
right.
know, the vast majority of them will just kind of appear and fizzle out very quickly, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah. Yeah, it's making me think of Nick Cave because I saw Nick Cave in 1997 here in Seattle. It was great. And he's coming
Oh
back
man,
this
I saw
year.
him around the same time
Oh,
actually. We really are of the same
yeah,
generation.
for yeah, for real. I think it was the Boatman's Call tour. I'm pretty sure that's what he was doing. It's just such
Yeah,
an amazing album.
right around the same
Um,
time. And I saw him with Julie Cruz opening
oh,
for him actually. So
oh,
yeah, I
R.I.P.
know.
Julie. I
It's
know.
very cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's so great. Oddly enough, I saw him open with Low, and I think the lead
Oh
singer
yeah.
from Low, she passed away, which is sad.
Yeah.
But
I remember that band too.
um,
They
but
had
I
some
was
great.
like, oh, they're coming back around. Nick Cave's coming back around. Awesome. I want to see Nick Cave. Yeah, the tickets are like $800. And I was like, Nick, come on.
Yeah, it's mainstream now.
I
It's
know.
like
I was like, what happened? Um, so
there's
that's
like
cool.
boomers going to Nick Cave shows
Exactly. Like, when did that happen?
now.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. Like, I mean, there are some, you know, there are some artists from the past that have still remained very on the edges of acceptability. Like I kind of feel like, you know, whatever. I don't want to criticize other artists and musicians and
Yeah,
things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. I feel like a lot of music that I grew up listening to in the 90s and the early 2000s, I'm not on the same page with a lot of where those musicians went later on.
Right.
You know, I still like a lot of what David Tibet does with Current 93 and so forth.
Hmm.
It's gone that, it still remains very, you know, difficult for a lot of people's ears, you know, which I appreciate, you know,
Right. Yeah.
but, you know, that happens. But, you know, even those, you know, bands that, you know, I thought was, you know, when I was in high school, I thought I have this, you know, love of, Current 93 and Nurse with Wound and Throbbing Gristle, like this is gonna, be my own like secret passion and mine alone. This could
Exactly.
never possibly become like a hipster thing that
Oh
like a
God.
lot of people are into. And, it didn't take long. It
Nope.
it happened very quickly.
Yeah.
I would just like, I think like, I went to art school and then like people had like, Nurse with Wound t-shirts. And I was like, what?
I thought that was
So,
mine. Yeah.
but that, yeah, it's fine. And I also don't think there's anything wrong with that either.
Yeah.
I think that's the life of a work of art.
Yeah.
And this is also something like the art historian in me, talking about esoteric music as much as esoteric art. Like, that again, like I said, with like these marginal mediumistic artists like Madge Gill and Hilma Afklint was obscure in the early 2000s. Like she was
Right.
exhibited, but she was obscure, and now she's this one of probably the most talked about artists from the 20th century. And and likewise with a lot of other even more, sensational artists. There was a time
Mm-hmm.
where no one cared who Frida Kahlo was,
Right.
but now she's like a phenomenon as an artist.
Yeah.
And that's the life of a work of art. A time will come when it will speak to a broader audience. So like, um, using Current 93, because that was like a band that was so inaccessible, I think, to a lot of people. you know, um, it it still is not very accessible, but
Right.
like it certainly has had like a resonance beyond this, small, weird punk scene in
Right.
England, from like whatever 40, 50 years ago or something. Like it's blossomed. And the same with a lot of like noise music as well. Like I was really into like Merzbow and White House and even more obscure kind of stuff when I was growing up. And I remember in the early 2000s, there was like a small, like kind of niche scene where you would have a few like noise guys, making some harsh noise or
Right.
something like that in a basement show or something like that. And that's become it has been a real scene for like the last 20 years or so. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it was just because it was a genre that's time has come, and it eventually spoke to a moment somehow.
Yeah.
Um, and it will probably and I'm not prone to speak, I'm not qualified to speak about what's popular in mainstream music today, unfortunately. Like I just can't keep up with anything that's going on. Pretty
Right.
much anything that came out after 2010, don't ask me about it. But I'm sure that noise, I'm sure that there's a through line that can be drawn from like Merzbow to like whatever the popular music is at the
Right.
moment. The producers are thinking about that kind of music, when they're working in the studio. And that's another way by which I see the most fringe elements of art
Mm-hmm.
having a kind of a ripple effect in culture and society and reality as
Right.
well, to take it more extreme.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
way to look at it. Yeah. So just keep creating things, people. Let's just
Yes.
keep doing that,
Yeah,
it gets
exactly.
in there somehow. That's amazing. Um, well, let's see. Gosh, we've chatted for a little while. I did want to touch on a couple more things. Just so I know you worked as a gemologist, and
Oh, yeah.
obviously, of course, once people figure that out and then see your work, you're like, like right there, it looks like that.
Yeah. I should have probably mentioned that right out of the gate, actually.
No.
But yeah, for a brief period of time. So, like a lot of people who get out of art school, I graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago, but, you know, that is a very prestigious art school, but, it's not necessarily a highway into gallery success. And, it teach a prestigious tenured teaching position, for
Hmm.
everyone. And so I moved back to New York. I had lived in Chicago and then I moved back to New York, and I struggled to find work, to find a job. And, simply put, my aunt who had lived in Manhattan for 40 years had been working as the in the accounting department of the Gemological Institute of America in Manhattan it was on 47th Street then. They might have moved their building, but um, and I was just kind of like, I need a job. Like, what do you have? And and she found, and I did an interview. They were hiring diamond graders, and I did an interview, and they accepted me into a program that they were doing to train
Mm.
um, diamond and gemstone graders, where you would get paid while doing a certificate program in gemology for like half a year or so. And so I did that. It was an intensive program. I made very little money during that time, and I was hired into the lab, and I started out working with mainly diamonds, other gemstones as well, but working with diamonds. And what you do is, every single day for 8 to 10 hours, you're in a dark laboratory with little cassettes of stones and a microscope and a computer, and you just look at the stones under a microscope for, and write a report on the computer. And there's also like a diagram you have to do drawings on and stuff like that.
Wow.
And I was not very good at my job, but I did that for like, almost 3 years, and I skated by somehow. I was very depressed during that time. I wasn't getting a lot of sunshine. I
Mm.
think I had a vitamin D deficiency because I was in this dark lab.
Yeah.
And it would actually be like dark morning when I went into the lab, and it would be dark evening when I came out. So rarely saw the sun. But I did spend a lot of time looking through the microscope at the crystal inclusions within stones. And so, and this was over 10 years. I mean, this is like 14 years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
This is a long time ago, but it's hard to not picture how that experience day in and day out for years on end would, find its way into the kind of visual vocabulary of my work, because the inside of stones is like this kind
Mhm.
of crystal prismatic universe all unto itself.
Yeah.
And I also, developed these very mystical views while I was looking at these stones. It's hard to look into that world and not see or not imagine or perceive some kind of invisible force moving through those kinds of uh creations, those crystalline creations. They're matter, they're physical
Yeah.
matter, but they absorb and bend and distort light in a way that is really, fantastic when you think about it.
Yeah.
So definitely was an influence on my work for sure. But I wasn't really very happy. So as soon
Right.
as I got accepted into the graduate program for art history at Brooklyn College, I was like, here's my 2 week notice, thank you. And I was out of there. But it was
Ah.
very fun. I worked in India for a time during
Oh,
that
wow.
period. But it was just, briefly, I worked in Mumbai and, 7 days a week, it wasn't like it wasn't like I was a tourist or anything. I was just like working all the time
Oh,
and stuff.
right.
But but it was, I don't want to bad talk my experience as a diamond grader. It was nice. It was a nice gig for a while.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure anybody can relate with like having a jobby job, and
Yes.
like, but
But here's the
yeah,
thing also, I think like the other thing I would say to
yeah,
other artists, who might be watching this, maybe,
yeah,
is like, let everything in to influence your work.
right,
Sometimes people feel they have to just make art about art history or the art world, or make it some
yeah,
lofty commentary on,
right,
uh, you know, economics and politics or something like that. But very likely the means that you have for communicating is right around you. It's in the nature
mm,
of your life, and whatever someone does for a living while they're making art might inform what they do eventually.
yeah,
So I was just like, open to all of these experiences shaping what I do. I
cool,
think it's like all a combination of everything. It's not just one experience that, shaped the way my paintings look.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Oh, that's such a great message. I love that, especially for artists, like young artists or any artists, like just do your thing. Great
Yeah, no,
art.
and absolutely. And I've had
Yeah.
people say to me, like, yeah, when you talk about like how your old job influenced your work, like I just realized, whatever I'm doing, might be, showing me something that I need to, incorporate into my art. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's like mopping floors or making
Yeah.
sandwiches or whatever you're doing. I don't know. I also
Yeah.
worked at like a chocolate shop for a little while. That
Right.
really didn't have any influence, but
Right.
it could have,
Could
though.
have. Yeah.
Could have.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I love that message. So the last thing I wanted, well, the last thing about sort of your art and your work is you have your Substack, which I subscribe to. It's I'm
Eidolon. I say
Eidolon,
Eidolon, but
Eidolon.
yeah.
I'm Eidolon. It's amazing. Like you have, obviously I can see from your, being a art history professor and your experience as an artist, just your experience as a human, but it's so detailed and in depth. Like I love that stuff. So I always enjoy when you put it out. So what
Oh,
was sort
thank
of
you.
your why'd you want to also do like some writing with along with your
Well, I've
artwork?
always loved to write, and I was hoping that Substack would become more of a regular outlet for me.
Oh yeah.
I post very infrequently,
Yeah.
unfortunately. It's whenever I can, and it's more of like it's more writings that I have like a passionate need to get out. It's
Mm-hmm.
not so much academic writings. It's not things that I might be doing on commission to write. It's more of like I just have something that's in my mind while I'm painting and I'm working and I need to get it out. Some of those writings I also made while, in a kind of altered state through meditation. So some of them are almost like free form automatic writings. So they're more personal and um, maybe should be seen as somewhere between an essay and a kind of poetic prose style. But and lately, what I've been doing now is writing shorter pieces so I can produce them more regularly, and
Mm-hmm.
they are direct counterpoints to whatever I'm working on in the studio as a painter. And, there are a lot of artists who are writers and they, maybe keep their writings private in a journal.
Right.
I think that's a fine practice to do. I do think that I do recommend if you're a painter or an artist of some sort, I do recommend writing. I like to share the writings. I like to get feedback on them. I have like things to say and stuff. But I think that, it's good to have a writing practice to clarify what you're thinking while you're working. And people are always going to ask you like, what's this painting about? Or like a gallery will ask you, can you write a little bit about what you were thinking when you were working on
Right.
this show or something? So like it may come up where someone asks you, and having that writing practice is, on a practical level beneficial in that way. But I
Yeah.
also think that it will help to clarify in your own mind things that are sometimes coming from a very ethereal place. When you're just working with visual language, you sometimes lose grasp of more tangible, linear thought, and language, lends itself more to linear thought. So it helps me
Mm-hmm.
in that way. I think keeping that Substack as a kind of literary journal for myself.
Cool. Yeah, such great practical advice. So much for
Yeah, yeah.
the
You can
artists. I
tell
love
I'm
it.
like a teacher who's used to
Yes,
like telling people things to do,
that's great.
as artists.
I love it. Um, so kind of, sort of the last couple things is so do you have any projects or events or things you want to let people know about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess I don't know when this is going to come out, but in October, I'm going to have a
Mhm.
show in Seoul in South Korea,
Oh, cool.
at a gallery called the Untitled Void. I think it's going to be a 2-person or 3-person show. I'm not sure, but I have 5 paintings that will be there. And next year, there's a show coming up at a gallery in Berlin, Kristen Hellierda Gallery. Um, and, maybe some other things. I don't know. And as I mentioned, I've been writing for the catalog for this or exhibition essay for this. For the artist Francis Smokowski. And so I've been working on that essay. And so that's it. And there might be other things, perhaps.
Very cool. Yeah, I just checked. So your episode will go out, I think, the Wednesday, October 16th. So right
Huh.
in the middle
Right
there.
before that. show opens
Yay.
and sold. Yeah.
Cool. That's really awesome, though. Okay, so the last thing, are there any words of wisdom that you would like to share with the audience?
Oh boy, I feel like I've given all my advice.
I know,
about
you're like, it's already
art.
out there. Yeah.
No, I don't know. I don't see myself as, I like to talk about art. I'm an art historian, I'm an artist. I can only really give my own perspective. Spiritually, I can only talk about my own experiences.
Right.
I'm not, a guru or a teacher of any sort, spiritually, so don't take any advice from me. And in terms of like, as an artist and a painter, I can only talk about my own experience and my own path. Everyone's going to have a different path and a different journey. I think maybe there might be parts of what I say that might resonate with people that they can take something away from. But obviously, I don't recommend anyone do what I've done. It's not, that's my words of wisdom. Like, don't, try to become a diamond grader and then, parlay that into becoming a painter. That's a terrible idea.
Oh my
So that's my
gosh.
words of wisdom.
Well, I will say that was probably the most unique words of wisdom I've had so far. So I really love it. Don't do what Alessandro does. The end.
Yes.
Oh gosh. Well, thank you so much, Alessandro. It was a pleasure. I loved it.
Thank you very much, Marilyn.
Talking about art with you. It was really,
yeah, I had a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Your support means the world to us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, and share it with others who might find this content valuable. And of course, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more enlightening discussions. Your engagement helps us grow, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for being a part of the Casual Temple community.